Here's the divorce agreement, Philip. I've already signed it. Please give it to Carlos Huo. It was difficult for Debbie Nian to work up the nerve to hand the agreement that would end her marriage to Philip Huo, the Huo family's steward. Sighing in resignation, Philip Huo went over the document and noticed clauses that made him frown. He looked at the girl sharply and bellowed, "Debbie!" Incredulous, he asked, "Do you realize how stupid this is? I can understand if you want to divorce Mr. Huo. After all, you haven't seen the man for the past 3 years. But why aren't you asking for any money?" At 20, Debbie Nian was an undergraduate. Her father died while she didn't know who her mother was. In Philip Huo's opinion, she shouldn't want a divorce, let alone get out of the marriage without any money. Debbie Nian scratched the back of her head in embarrassment. She was well aware that Philip Huo always treated her as a daughter, so she had no plans to keep anything from him. I want to drop out of school," she stammered. "What? Why do you suddenly want to leave school? What happened? Are you being bullied?" The steward's eyes widened in astonishment. No. You're overreacting, Philip. You already know I don't like studying. So, I don't want to waste my time in university," she explained. The excuse of dropping out of school was lame, but the only one that came to mind quickly to stall him off. But she was not telling anyone the real reason for wanting a divorce. She was silent for a while as several thoughts ran through her mind. "Tomorrow is my 21st birthday and 3rd wedding anniversary. I'm still young. I don't want this hollow marriage to stand in the way of pursuing true love. I've never even seen Carlos Huo in person. My father arranged this marriage. How can anyone live like this?" She thought desperately. Sensing that the girl was not about to share anything else, Philip Huo conceded, "It appears you've made up your mind, so I will." He waited for her to say something. "I'll hand the divorce papers to Mr. Huo tomorrow," the steward said with a deep sigh when she didn't respond. "Thank you so much, Philip." She let out a huge sigh of relief before giving the man a sweet smile. But Philip Huo could not help himself as he stared at the young girl. "Debbie, Mr. Huo is a good man. I believe you are a perfect match, so I do hope you will think this through carefully and reconsider. If you change your mind, you may call me any time," he said sincerely. Of all he said, 2 words stood out that made Debbie Nian cringe. Perfect match? He didn't even show up at the wedding. The man was at a dinner reception for a foreign president at that time. And the photograph on our marriage certificate was photoshopped. In the last 3 years, I haven't even laid eyes on him. So, what is Philip saying that we are a perfect match? Debbie Nian couldn't control the sarcastic thoughts in her head. Finally coming to her senses, the young lady took a deep breath before speaking again. She had intended to say, "I've made up my mind." But as a sign of respect for Philip Huo, who was truly concerned for her, she uttered, "Okay," thinking that she might have a change of heart. Philip Huo waited until the next afternoon to inform Carlos Huo about the divorce papers. But to his disappointment, she didn't call him. Slowly, he brought out his cell phone and dialed a number. "Mr. Huo, I have a document that needs your signature," he said respectfully. "What document is that?" came the cold reply. He noted a hint of impatience in Carlos Huo's voice. Then the pen in his hand froze as Carlos Huo let the words sink in. He closed his eyes and rubbed his brows thoughtfully. It quickly dawned on him as he thought, "Oh, I have a wife. If Philip didn't call me now, I wouldn't even remember that I am married and have a wife. Just put the papers in my study. I'll be back in Y City in a couple of days," Carlos Huo said coolly. "Yes, Mr. Huo," Philip Huo acknowledged and then hung up. Meanwhile, at the Blue Night Bar in Y City, the bar was dimly lit but packed with people. Young men and women flocked to the establishment that was among the very popular in town. Inside room 501 was a table littered with beer, wine, champagne, and a variety of snacks. The room was the venue for a birthday party. The celebrant was Debbie Nian, who turned 21 that day. Nicknamed Tomboy by her classmates, Debbie Nian now wore a pink lace dress. This was one of the very few occasions that she donned something feminine instead of her usual attire of jeans and shirts. Several of the female guests whipped out their phones to have a selfie with Debbie Nian. After everyone had their fill of taking photos, the celebrant started to have fun by drinking with her classmates. Stacked in one corner of the room were the many presents Debbie Nian received from friends and classmates. A slightly tipsy Jared Han broke out in a song, with his arms slung around another boy's shoulders. "I knew you were trouble when you walked in," he warbled. His voice was so grating that many of the girls covered their ears and groaned. "Hey Jared, stop that singing. Let's just play games that won't bust anybody's eardrums." It was Casey Zhang, one of Debbie Nian's roommates, who called out to Jared Han. She was a cheerful girl, full of confidence, who always got people's attention. Her suggestion had everyone in the room turning silent. The boys and girls in the room turned to look at Casey Zhang, waiting for her instructions. She was a known party animal and was popular among the classmates. Looking at everyone with mischief in her eyes, Casey Zhang said, "Let's play truth or dare." A cunning smile crossed her lips as guests balked at the suggestion. Several of them cast a scornful glance at the girl. "Casey, that game sucks." This time, Jared Han, a rich second generation, got back at Casey Zhang. He rolled his eyes in disgust because he thought it was a boring game. Casey Zhang stared at Jared Han defiantly and continued, "Today is Debbie's 21st birthday, so we'll make the game more exciting. She flashed an evil smile that made some of the guests uncomfortable. Since all people at the party were students, many were still pure and innocent. They were familiar with the game. The consequences for the dares were usually singing the high notes in Mariah Carey's Loving You, carrying the heaviest guy around the room, or singing a duet with the opposite sex. But Casey Zhang had something else in mind for Debbie Nian. The celebrants' cheeks were already crimson from too much champagne and wine. As the first round started, Casey Zhang winked at the others, who quickly caught on what she was planning. The loser in this round has to go out the door, turn right, and then kiss the first person of the opposite sex they run into on the lips. If he or she opts to skip this consequence, there is an alternative. He or she has to drink 10 glasses of wine, Casey Zhang declared. Everyone became excited about the game. They were all eager to find out who the first loser would be. This time Jared Han snorted in disgust but said nothing. He knew there was already collusion. After playing rock, paper, scissors, everyone turned to look at the celebrant, who was dumbfounded. Debbie Nian stared at her hand, which formed the scissors symbol, and then glanced at the others who held out rocks. Her eyes widened, and her jaw slackened. "I hate you, Casey Zhang," she screamed. Remembering the consequence, the birthday girl felt like crying. She was already drunk, and couldn't afford 10 more glasses of wine. Mustering her courage, she took several deep breaths before opening the door. Following instructions, she turned right. Standing in the hallway was a man dressed in a crisp white shirt, black slacks, and black leather shoes. He looked to be in his mid-20s and stood around 180 centimeters tall. His face was all angles and planes, from his forehead, cheeks to his jawline. His looks were the type that would stand out in a crowd. His eyes, however, were so cold that Debbie Nian couldn't help but shiver when he glanced at her. "Wow, he is one handsome dude. Tomboy, hurry up. We're watching you," Casey Zhang said in a loud whisper. Debbie Nian stood frozen for a moment. She was busy thinking, he looked somewhat familiar. Where have I met him before? But Casey Zhang's voice broke into her thoughts, so she took a deep breath and plucked up more courage. Still there was this niggling thought, I think I've met him before. Never mind, I'd better make this quick. Bravely, she walked up to the man, gave him a sweet smile and stood on tiptoe. His cologne wafted through her nose. Carlos Huo was looking for a quiet place to make a phone call when he was stopped by a girl in the hallway. He frowned in annoyance as Debbie Nian approached him. Something clicked his mind. Why does she look so familiar? Her eyes. Carlos Huo thought, trying to recall the face. As he pondered who the girl was, Debbie Nian planted a soft kiss on his lips and caught him off guard. After planting a kiss on Carlos' lips, Debbie immediately withdrew, fled the hallway and ran straight back to the room. "Debbie!" Casey shrieked as she shut the door. "You were awesome, girl," she said proudly, slapping the celebrant on the back. Panting after her escape, Debbie heaved a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Carlos' face darkened after the surprise kiss. He stood rooted to the spot but saw the girl disappear inside room 501. The man was about to ask his bodyguards to haul Debbie out of the room and throw her into the sea when his phone rang. Annoyed over the interruption, he answered the call. After listening for a few seconds, he snapped, "Okay, I'll be right there." He pressed the button to end the call and then glanced at room 501. He inhaled sharply to control his fury. There was an emergency in his company, which needed immediate attention. "Count your lucky stars today, woman. You better pray I never see you again. You won't get away the next time you provoke me," Carlos muttered as he turned to leave. Inside room 501, Debbie rubbed her red cheeks and felt them burning in embarrassment. It was the most insane thing she had ever done in her life. Heart pounding, her mind was a jumble of thoughts. Oh my God, that was my first kiss. And I don't even know who he was. Could that have been cheating on my husband? Oh, never mind. I've already signed the divorce agreement. And it's okay even if Carlos isn't willing to sign it. Legally, a couple who's been separated for more than 2 years is deemed to be automatically divorced anyway. I haven't seen him in the 3 years we've been married. So maybe legally I'm no longer his wife. That means I was not cheating on him. Besides, it was just a kiss. Debbie forgot everyone around her. Suddenly Casey yelled, "My goodness!" All her classmates jumped at her outburst. "What is wrong with you, Casey? You scared me to death." Christina Lin, who was about to drink wine, spilled the liquid and was patting her chest to calm down. Excitedly, Casey stepped up to Debbie, who was still lost in thought, and shook her shoulders. "Do you know who that man is?" she demanded. The object of Debbie's prank was a man every woman dreamed of. He was young, handsome, rich, and powerful, and he owned a large multinational group. People called him Mr. Huo as a sign of respect. "So, who is he?" Debbie demanded while grabbing a glass of champagne and taking a big gulp. "Carlos Huo." Casey yelled the name as she looked at the celebrant's face. The name was supposed to say everything about who the man was, so she wanted to be sure Debbie heard it right. The champagne sputtered out of the girl's mouth the moment Casey said Carlos' name. Debbie began coughing violently, unaware that she had spat the liquid on her roommate's face. Instead of getting mad after being showered by champagne on the face, Casey was stunned. Even Jared was flabbergasted when he heard the name. "Mr. Huo? Tomboy, I think you're screwed," he said. Jared was the son of the general manager of a finance company in Y City, and Carlos' name struck his ears like a roar of thunder. The familiar name also made Christina Lin scream. "Debbie, you kissed Mr. Huo." "Oh, let me kiss you because it's like kissing him indirectly," she teased her friend. Grabbing a handful of tissues, Debbie proceeded to clean her friend's face but was too shocked to apologize. When Christina Lin came forward, Debbie hurled the tissues towards the table and ran away as fast as she could. Suddenly, she remembered something. "Casey, did you call my name when I was in the hallway?" she asked. She shuddered at the thought. "Damn it, what if he remembers my name?" Spunky Casey snatched more tissues to dry her face and answered in an angry voice. "Yes, I did. Is that what has you excited?" "Yes, it must have been thrilling to kiss Mr. Huo, but you were only overacting, right?" She cursed Debbie quietly. "You brat. Oh my god, my face, and my hair. There is champagne everywhere." Patting Casey's arm as much to console as to apologize, Debbie suddenly said, "You guys have fun. I need to leave now." As soon as she said the words, the birthday celebrant left hurriedly. Everyone watched her receding figure with a stunned expression. All her friends were thinking the same thing. What was she going to do, catch up with Mr. Huo? She was out of her mind. They all heard that many women had been after Carlos. And to get rid of these women, he would ask his men to peel off their clothes and toss them out on the street. He might do that to their friend, so they all had the same idea to stop Debbie from going to Carlos. Many of her friends ran out of the room, hoping to prevent Debbie from whatever she planned on doing. But the girl was nowhere to be found. As soon as Debbie stepped out of the bar, she hailed a taxi and instructed the driver to bring her to the villa where she was staying. "I hope Carlos did not recognize me and won't come to the villa tonight. Otherwise, he may think I regretted asking for a divorce," and kissed him to get his attention. Leaning against the back of the seat, Debbie kept thinking about what happened. After they got the marriage certificate 3 years ago, Carlos assigned Philip to take care of her food, clothing, and anything she needed. But not once had she seen the man she married. On the one hand, he was busy with work and spent most of his time overseas to take care of business. On the other hand, even when he was in Y City, Carlos stayed in another villa. They had different friends and acquaintances. As a result, they had never met each other, not even once, in those 3 years. As for the marriage certificate, her father kept it with him when he was still alive. But just before his death, he had given it to Carlos in his fear that Debbie would divorce her husband. So, it wasn't until now that Debbie knew what her Carlos looked like. Sitting up, she suddenly remembered something and slapped her forehead. "Oh, I remember seeing him once," the young woman thought. She had gone to his office to visit a couple of times. But every time, it was Carlos' assistant who received her, precluding any opportunity to get a glimpse of her husband. The last time she went to the company, Debbie didn't introduce herself, so guards prevented her from entering the building. At that time, Carlos had just come back from an overseas trip, and while standing outside, she saw her husband getting out of the car from a distance. Unfortunately, she was too far to get a good look at him, and it was a long time ago. Even when she knew his name, she never found any photo of Carlos on the internet. He kept a very low profile, never granting interviews with the media and not allowing anyone to post his picture online. There was one time, though, when Carlos' picture was published. In that photo, it was said that he was holding the hand of an actress. But before Debbie could get a glimpse of the photo, it had been deleted. Now she finally saw her husband's face, and she even got to kiss him. If he had signed the divorce papers, technically, he would be her ex-husband. While Carlos was known not to lack women for company, he hated the female species who took the initiative to get close to him. So that was one more reason for Debbie to be agitated. "Oh my God, I'm screwed. I truly hope he didn't recognize me," she kept praying silently. When she arrived at the villa, she heaved a deep sigh of relief when she noted no light was on. Maybe he didn't hear Casey call my name and didn't even recognize me. "Thank God for that," she muttered, tapping her still blushing face. She threw herself on the living room couch and recalled everything that happened tonight. If he recognized me, he would no doubt dislike me. But maybe that's better. Then he'd sign the divorce agreement without hesitation, she mumbled. Debbie was a junior student in Class 22 of Finance Department of School of Economics and Management in Y City University. There were more than 50 enrolled in her class. 40 of them passed through the college entrance exam, while the rest went through the back door. Y City University was among the top 3 local universities. Even Carlos graduated from this institution. There was a long line of people wanting to enroll in the university. Debbie was one of them and got in though the back door. Mark Doe, an old professor, stood on the platform in front of his class. He pushed his glasses up his nose and took a deep breath while staring at his students. Most of them were sleepy. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The professor threw a book on his desk. The sound brought many students back to their senses, and they quickly sat up. But one of them, a girl in a white leisure coat, who sat in the last row, was still asleep on her desk. Fuming with rage, Mark Doe roared, "Debbie Nian!" He might be old with gray, grizzly hair, but his voice was still booming. In the silence that ensured you could hear a pin drop. But neither the noise nor the silence made any difference to Debbie, who was still sound asleep. Everyone was staring at her as she remained in dreamland. "Debbie! Debbie!" A light voice kept calling out to Debbie as she was dozing off. Refusing to wake up, Debbie felt a constant tug at her sleeve. The more she ignored it, the stronger the voice and the tugging went. This got Debbie to give up, and she finally woke up. Though it was clear that she was still half asleep, Debbie groggily turned her head towards Christina. Christina, you better have a good reason for waking me up. What Debbie saw as Christina's response was a finger pointing somewhere. Debbie's eyes followed where Christina pointed, and she saw an absolutely exasperated Mark on stage. Just witnessing Mark's protracted face was similar to being splashed on the face with ice-cold water in Debbie's opinion. Oh, crap! Scrambling to get herself back together, Debbie shook her head violently and then sat upright. Mark, who was the professor that stood in front, was considered to be one of the remarkably hard-headed professors in their university. Taking the subject book out from her bag, Debbie then opened the book at the proper page and sent an icy glare to whoever dared laugh. Almost immediately, Debbie's classmates turned their attentions back to the front, feigning that they didn't realize what was happening. Once the situation was sorted out, their Professor Mark had returned to teaching. Oh God, he looked so angry. Debbie buried her hands through her hair in regret. I'm definitely going to fail his exams. No one in the room attempted to taunt Debbie. Everyone in the room, as well as the whole university, knew that Debbie possessed a cryptic background. Besides, Debbie was still a rowdy student as she constantly clashed with others, doused herself in alcohol, and cut classes. In short, she had done things that were deemed unacceptable by the university. Within Y City University, it was stated in the student handbook that students were neither allowed to dye their hair of any color, paint their nails, nor wear extravagant jewelry to the campus. However, Debbie didn't care as she possessed long lilac-dyed hair and bright red nails. The professors in the university were too terrified to tell her off about it. It was surprising that Debbie hadn't found herself expelled from the university. The reason for that was that she came from a family with power. Debbie Nian, Mark called out coldly. Please explain to me what finance is. The professor knew well of Debbie's background. Someone with the name of Emmett Jong, who was Carlos' assistant, had something to do with Mark's assignment in the university. Even Carlos himself was a former student of Mark's. As a responsible teacher, Mark knew that he had to intervene as he wouldn't allow his students, Debbie in particular, to submit to her vices. Feigning to look at the book, Debbie then sent a kick to the seat in front of her. Seated across her was none other than the class monitor and straight-A student, Dixon Shu. With that as a signal, Dixon Shu knew what Debbie meant, and he quickly flipped the pages of the book to where the answer was written and slid it to his left side for her to see. A smile of satisfaction was etched on Debbie's profile as the book was made visible to her eyes. Many stole glances towards Debbie, and all could agree that she looked stunning. She possessed features a girl would kill for, such as perfect fair skin, a pair of round, innocent eyes, a beautifully shaped nose, and soft, red lips. Although Debbie's face was bare and free of makeup, her profile still remained ethereal. Not to mention, her pair of long, slender legs were a treat for all boys to see. If only her academic performance were better, she would perfectly fit the title of Miss University. Alright, let's see here. Debbie stood up and blinked as she began to read from Dixon Shu's book. Finance is a broad term that describes two related activities: the study of how money is managed and... As the professor, Mark saw right through Debbie's trick. This got him outraged. Enough! Mark's voice thundered across the room, making the whole class frightened. The students could see how their professor was desperately keeping his anger in check. Everyone was frightened and glued to their seats, all except for Debbie, who flashed Mark a smile and asked, "Professor Doe, is my answer wrong?" With that, Mark started to turn red in anger, and Debbie couldn't help but regret whatever she did and started to beg for forgiveness. "Professor Doe, please don't get mad at me. I'll memorize the answer by heart before the class ends," Debbie promised. Even she had people whom she feared, and this professor was one of them, as she knew Carlos was one of Mark's former students. The color red then started to leave Mark's profile as he calmed down upon hearing Debbie's words. In Mark's opinion, Debbie was a clever girl. If she just put her mind into studying, she could very well be an intelligent, straight-A student. But, as a professor, Mark could not further tolerate Debbie's insolent actions. "You don't like studying? Fine. You failed many exams? Fine." Mark then sent Debbie a glare. "But you're not allowed to fail in my class," he swore to himself. "If you dare to sleep in my class again, Jared Han, Christina Lin, and Casey Zheng, the three of them will go stand under the flag," Mark declared. "Do you understand?" The three whose names were mentioned groaned in disbelief upon their professor's statement. "Why are we the ones suffering when Debbie commits mistakes?" They all thought in chorus. The reason why Mark made this decision was that he knew Debbie was loyal to her friends. The intention of hurting others for her own personal gains was far beyond Debbie. This was one of the advantages Mark saw with Debbie's attitude. Casting a burning glare towards their Professor Mark, Debbie cursed in the depths of her mind. "Why, you cunning little piece of..." Lifting her head up, Debbie then responded in confidence. "Got it, Professor Doe. You'll never see me doze off in your class ever again." Sitting herself back down in her seat, Debbie then picked up her pen and started to write on the notebook she had. A look of satisfaction was present on Mark's face as he thought she was taking notes while in reality, she was just doodling. When the bell rang, Mark said his final words before collecting his things and then eventually left the room. Classes were officially dismissed. The moment Mark left, several boys and girls gathered around Debbie, and started to state their complaints regarding their professor. "Hey, tomboy, what's up with Professor Doe?" Jared asked. The look of frustration was written all over Jared's face. Why the heck did he choose to deal with us instead of Debbie? He's a strange man, he thought to himself. Measuring 210 centimeters in height, Jared was one of the students blessed with height and considered to be the tallest in the whole university. To add, Jared was one of Debbie's closest friends and he was a generous guy. "Debbie, please don't sleep in Professor Doe's class again," Christina whined as she held onto Debbie's arm tightly and acted in a charming manner. "I'm begging you, Christina." Debbie, another friend, possessed long, curly hair and a petite body, yet oozing with charm. "Debbie, as Miss Room 3301, I can't afford to lose face in public like that, all right?" said Casey, who proclaimed herself as the most beautiful girl in the dormitory. Currently, Debbie's spirits were low because of the whole divorce matter and the kiss between her and Carlos. The noise that surrounded Debbie started to irritate her. Taking the book in hand, she then slammed it against the desk and the crisp sound of the book hitting the table reverberated throughout the whole room, sending everyone into a state of shock. Debbie started to irritate her. Taking the book in hand, she then slammed it against the desk and the crisp sound of the book hitting the table reverberated throughout the whole room, sending everyone into a state of shock. Uncover treasures of imagination at. Everyone in that room knew that if they looked back, they'd be frozen as they felt Debbie's cold gaze lingering around them. They all zipped their mouths shut. Feeling the tension growing heavy in the air, Casey then spoke up in hope of alleviating the tension. "Hey, I just remembered. There's a grand promotion in the Shining International Plaza today. Do you guys want to come?" Standing and snaking her way towards Casey, Debbie flashed a dazzling smile and said, "Me? Probably just because of the lipstick she's always wanted to have." Casey rolled her eyes playfully. As close friends, Casey and Debbie knew each other like the back of their hands. Debbie usually engaged in fights and doused herself in alcohol. It was a surprising trait for her to be so interested in lipsticks. Never did she bother about the clothes she wore as she would dress casually. However, her interest of collecting a kaleidoscope of lipsticks was unstoppable. At the Shining International Plaza, the group all gathered up and they had finally arrived at the Shining International Plaza. Inside the said plaza contained so much beauty as it had so much to offer. The Shining International Plaza consisted of 7 buildings, named after the stars that made up the constellation of the Big Dipper. The names of the building were Dubhi, Merak, Fekta, Migres, Alioth, Mizar, and Akkad. At the peak of each building, there were several lights, and when night fell, the lights were lit and you possessed a bird's eye view. The lights formed the constellation of the Big Dipper. Indeed, it was a breathtaking spectacle. The domestic lighting designs has been designed to resemble the diamond-studded skies, giving you a feeling that you were walking through the sea of stars. It would not be surprising for several people to fall in love with such a plaza wrapped around a unique concept with the Big Dipper. Thus, being a famous dating spot wherein you'd see people of all ages take their loved ones out for a get-together or a date to gaze closely into the stars. In a cosmetics and skincare shop located inside the Merak building, 3 girls named Debbie, Casey, and Christina were frolicking inside the mall as they held each other's hands. Meanwhile, the 2 boys, Jared and Dixon, followed behind them with a dozen of shopping bags in their hands. They were absolutely drained out. Seeing how the 3 girls were still so full of energy, one of the guys, Jared in particular, started to complain. "How in the world are you all not tired? You all didn't seem so energetic in long-distance running before. Dixon and I are tired. Can't we just sit down and rest?" One of the girls turned to Jared and approached him. It was none other than Christina. "Oh, come on, Jared. How could you say that? You're tall, even," Christina said as she took some bags from Jared to lessen the load he had carried. Look, Debbie pointed at the shop just in front of them. "That's our final stop. Thank the Lord above. I'm saved," Jared exclaimed. Taking out her brand new purse, Casey then flashed a smile. "I'll treat you guys to lunch." Perking up at a thought that Jared then only remembered, he responded jubilantly, "Great, I'll make sure to indulge myself." One of the buildings in the Shining International Plaza, the Alioth building, consisted of several posh and luxurious restaurants, and on the 5th floor, there resided one of the most highly regarded restaurants in Y City. Clearly, Jared knew where he wanted to go. "You can eat whatever you want except." Casey then cast a scornful glance towards Jared and added, "The 5th floor, you hear?" On the 5th floor of the Alioth building, all rooms were VIP booths which required minimum charge. Whatever dish you desired, there would be a professional cook. You could watch as the cook prepared the dish right in front of your eyes. If you were lucky enough, you might just even be served by a Michelin 3-star cook. With such a premise for a restaurant, people could only dream of feasting at the delectable dishes served on the 5th floor. Although, due to the cost, only a selected few could afford to dine in such luxury. The moment Casey finished uttering her statement, Jared turned white, as if his soul had left his body, and repeated what Casey said in monotony. "You can eat whatever you want except for the 5th floor." Everyone was amused by Jared's reaction. Patting his shoulder, Debbie then pointed over to a couch nearby and offered, "Why don't you and Dixon sit down over there and rest? Lipstick picking takes a while." The 3 girls then began to select their preferred cosmetics. One saleslady saw Debbie holding a lipstick set, so she approached her with a friendly smile and said, "Miss, that product is one of the best sellers. There's only one left, so if you really like it, then I suggest you grab this last one." "No way," Debbie said in disbelief. "Only one left." Turning the tag over to see the price, Debbie then saw how much the lipstick set she held in her hand cost. It cost $129.999. Upon learning about its price, she started to have second thoughts. Sitting on the couch and taking a rest, Jared looked around and saw Debbie looking at the lipstick set she held in her hand. He then spoke aloud. "Hey, tomboy, why are you hesitating? You ride a car worth millions to school every day. Buying that lipstick set wouldn't hurt you. If you want it, just buy it." Hearing what Jared said clearly, Debbie sighed before responding, "The car isn't mine. No matter how expensive the car was, it had nothing to do with Debbie at all. All of the riches she had now were all thanks to her husband. There was nothing she could possibly flaunt." At that moment, the people in the area all turned their heads, and this struck odd for Debbie. What's going on? What are they looking at? Doing the same as the others, Debbie turned her head towards the direction where everyone else had their eyes fixed, and what she saw startled her. Several people were approaching, and the man in the center was wearing a black tailored suit that accentuated his statuesque body. The dark brown leather shoes he wore contrasted the gleaming marble floor. The man possessed dark eyes so deep and stern that no one dared to look him in the eye. "Oh my God!" Debbie gasped. "It's him. It's Carlos." The man that arrived in the venue and caught everyone's attention in a fraction of a second was none other than Carlos, Debbie's husband. Well, ex-husband in a couple of days. And standing right beside Carlos was someone who matched his status. There stood a fine lady who was blessed with a gorgeous face and a slim figure. Unlike the other men who were full of wealth and power, Carlos seldom linked himself with a woman. Thus, this drew a lot of questions, especially to Debbie. He's actually shopping with a girl, she thought to herself. Is this woman his girlfriend? As if sensing Debbie's gaze on him, Carlos turned to look at her. Heart skipping a beat, Debbie lowered her head and feigned that she was obsessed with the lipstick set. Eyes shut, Debbie chanted in desperation. "Please let him not see me. Please let him not see me." Only then did something hit Debbie, and she opened her eyes in realization. Wait, he doesn't even know me. With confidence, Debbie then fully lifted her head up and turned to Casey. "Hey Casey, do you think I should buy this?" However, Casey's attention was not focused on Debbie at all. Taking Debbie's arm and shaking it violently, Casey cried in excitement, "Debbie, this must be fate. You met Mr. Huo again." Turning to Debbie, Casey then asked, her eyes sparkling, "Do you think he still remembers you?" Walking up to them was Christina, who also threw Debbie a question. "Debbie, who's the girl beside Mr. Huo? How the hell do you think I'd know?" Debbie cried to herself. "Hey, tomboy." Jared then came in the picture as well. "Do you think Mr. Huo's here for you? Where in the world did you even get that idea?" Debbie retorted in silence. Spotting her friend Casey practically drooling at Carlos, Debbie called her attention. "Hey, Casey Zhang, you're drooling." Before Casey could even say anything to her defense, a girl's voice cut in. "I don't think you should buy it. The real question is, can you even afford it?" Turning her head to find where the voice came from, Debbie then saw it belonged to the girl that stood beside Carlos. "Do I even know her?" Debbie thought to herself, puzzled. "Hell, why is she even talking to me?" The woman who held Carlos by his arm went by the name of Olgami. She had dark brown, curly locks, her lips were dyed in deep red, and her nails were painted with a shade of brown. Breaking away from Carlos, Olgami then approached Debbie and took the lipstick set away from Debbie's grasp as she faced the saleslady. With a pompous smile on her face, she said, "I'll take this. Pack it for me." After uttering those words, Olgami turned to Debbie and eyed her from head to toe. A smile of mockery was now present on Olgami's face. She's just a university student pretending to be so pure and innocent. Why did Carlos steal a few glances at her? Yeah, sure she's pretty, but this girl is clearly no match for me, Olgami proudly said to herself as she wore a smug smile. Seeing that smile on Olgami's face instantly blew up Debbie's fuse. "Why did you look at me like that? How did you know I can't afford it?" Debbie started, uttering her words quickly. "Yes, sure. You're dressed in designer clothing from head to toe. But so what? What else do you have?" Doing the same as what Olgami had done to her, Debbie eyed her from head to toe and rolled her eyes. "I don't see a pretty face nor a perfect body." From a pompous expression, Olgami glared at Debbie sourly as she clenched her fists in anger. "Poor people like you shouldn't even be allowed to step foot in this mall. I mean, look at your feeble taste in fashion. You shouldn't be allowed to enter such a posh place." "Oh, I shouldn't be allowed to enter," Debbie repeated in mockery. "And who are you exactly to say that, Boldly taking a step forward to the woman named Olgami, Debbie continued to taunt her as she leaned forward and wore a sarcastic smile. "Hey there, auntie. Do you need any help? You must be in your 40s, aren't you? Look at your olive-colored dress. That's definitely the color we young, fresh girls don't wear." Nonetheless, Debbie's words did not just only offend Olgami, but also Carlos indirectly. But why? It was because the dress that Debbie had ridiculed was selected none other than Carlos himself. When Carlos and Olgami had been at the clothing department center a moment ago, He had just casually pointed to the dress and paid for it. This clearly implied that Debbie just called Carlos out for his mediocre taste in fashion. The dress itself was not bad, but it fit the 27-year-old Olga Mi poorly. It was a bodycon dress, and those kind of dresses were made for women who were blessed with the body shape of an hourglass. However, Olga Mi's body resembled a rectangle. Her body was absent of curves. The bodycon dress worked against her body as it highlighted her shortcomings. A flat chest and a non-existent ass. Never did Olga Mi experience such mockery, as she was treated like a princess in the Mi family, and all treated her with utmost respect. Thus, it is only natural for Olga Mi to be seething in anger. With the unbearable humiliation, Olga Mi quickly ran to Carlos' side and pleaded for his help. Mustering the most heartbroken voice she could ever make, she claimed, "Mr. Huo, did you hear what that girl said? She said I'm old, and she just basically called your taste mediocre. Unforgivable." Taking a closer look at the woman named Debbie, Carlos finally recognized her and his eyes dilated. That was the girl who had kissed him at the bar. Tilting to Olga, Carlos only then realized that Debbie did have a point. The dress did look dark and old-fashioned. When Carlos was selecting clothes for Olga just a while ago, it'd be more accurate to say that Carlos just pointed at whatever his eye saw first. When she put it on, he didn't even bat an eye. Thus, he was clueless about how she even looked. Upon taking a closer look at Olga, Carlos had to admit that Debbie was right. Olga's body shape didn't showcase the dress to its full potential. Lips curving up ever so slightly, Carlos was amused. Though in a fraction of a second, his profile was devoid of expression. The moment Olga complained to Carlos, everyone in the store eyed him, as if telling him to defend Olga, yet Carlos' lips remained sealed. Feeling defamed, Olga remained still. However, her ego wouldn't settle for it. Once again, she pouted her lips, in the hope of saying more, but the moment she looked up to meet Carlos' eyes, she was frozen, intimidated by his frigid expression. Standing behind Carlos was none other than his assistant Emmett. The said male eyed Debbie as well, his brows furrowed together pondering. Have I seen that girl before? Suddenly, it dawned upon him. Quickly, he approached Carlos and said in a faint voice, "Mr. Huo, that girl is your—" Right before Emmett could say the most vital word of all, he was interrupted by a loud voice which he knew belonged to Debbie. "Hey, I almost didn't see you there," Debbie exclaimed, maneuvering her way towards Emmett. "It's you. How have you been?" Unable to even respond, Emmett was taken by the arm and dragged aside by Debbie. "Oh my God, this guy was the one who helped me apply for the marriage certificate with Carlos," Debbie told herself. "Dad always used me to open up doors for Carlos, as we always made sure to visit him, and this guy right here was the man who always received us." Debbie wore a face full of grit, thinking, "I can't let Carlos know who I am. I mean, I kissed him last time and now we saw each other again. He may as well believe that I did that all on purpose to just grab his attention." Mr. Emmett wanted to address her as Mrs. Huo, but once again was interrupted. "Miss, don't you remember me? It's me," Debbie remarked rather excitedly. Puzzled, Emmett turned to Debbie. "Miss, I was going to—" "Hey, dude!" Debbie threw a playful punch onto Emmett's chest, quickly changing the subject. "Don't be so formal around me. That's so weird." Emmett was absolutely stunned as he was dragged further away from Carlos. There were so many questions running inside his mind, and he knew himself that they wouldn't be answered. With enough distance away from Carlos to prevent him hearing, Debbie's expression then grew wary. "Mrs. Huo, why were you doing this?" Emmett asked. "Mr. Huo hasn't seen you before. Therefore, I have to introduce you to him." Hearing Emmett's statement made Debbie want to laugh. "Yeah, we've been married for 3 years, but my husband over there didn't even recognize me." Debbie scoffed internally. "If it weren't for that damn marriage certificate, I'd still be single, and there would also be no way I would recognize the CEO of some international group." Pulling Emmett closer to her, Debbie then whispered, "Look, there's no need to introduce me. Why, I've already signed the divorce papers and asked Philip to hand them over to Mr. Huo. So yeah, there's really no reason for Mr. Huo to know me." "Divorce papers?" Emmett repeated, appalled. "You intend to divorce Mr. Huo?" In shock, Emmett took a few steps back and looked at Debbie, starting to ponder. "If I'm right, Mrs. Huo is 7 years younger than Mr. Huo. Wouldn't girls like her kill to be a rich and handsome man's wife?" Glancing towards Carlos for a brief moment and then back to Debbie, Emmett still couldn't wrap his mind around why Debbie would file for a divorce. Is there something wrong with her? Mr. Huo is handsome, rich, and powerful. Yet why would she want to divorce him? Beaming awkwardly, Debbie responded, "Yes, I want to divorce Mr. Huo. Also, I hope you can just keep my identity a secret from him, so that there wouldn't be any more trouble." Stunned and shell-shocked, Emmett was at a loss for words. There seemed to be more questions in his mind than there had been before. Retracting from his own line of thoughts, Emmett walked back to Carlos while the latter had just purchased the lipstick set for Olga. There was no doubt that Carlos would be suspicious of Emmett. Shifting his glance towards Debbie, Carlos then found her throwing herself into Jared's arms. A smile seething with contempt was present throughout Carlos' profile. What a harlot, he thought. A fragment of Carlos' memory played itself in his mind. He had been kissed by Debbie, whom he had just now labeled as a harlot. Face turning dark, he snapped his head towards his assistant Emmett and commanded, Throw her out of this mall. This girl is forbidden to step in this mall from now on. I don't care what your relationship with her is. Do I make myself clear? Mistakes and failures shouldn't be repeated, and that was what Carlos intended to do, as he wouldn't miss this opportunity and let Debbie off once again. It wasn't the first time Emmett had seen Carlos' furious look, but this time it seemed different. Following where Carlos' gaze was falling, Emmett finally understood why. In their sight, a young girl was clinging to a young boy's arm, acting all pettishly charming. It was Debbie and Jared, and once again, Jared was dragged into one of Debbie's shenanigans. Jared, honey, I want those lipsticks too. Debbie's tone was considerably higher than her default voice. Turning her gaze towards Olga, Debbie then pointed at her, looked up to Jared and pouted. I mean, look at that auntie over there. Her boyfriend just bought her a lipstick set. Taking hold of Jared's hand into hers, Debbie smiled sweetly and continued, why don't you do the same for me? This was Debbie's first time to act so whimsical towards someone, let alone it had to be her friend, Jared. This was obviously the first and last time she was ever to do this in her entire lifetime. Placing a hand on his chest in shock, Jared eyed Debbie oddly and asked, hey, tomboy, what's up with you? Don't scare me. All of Debbie's friends were astounded by the act she was putting on. Is this the real Debbie? There's no way she would do that. She has been replaced by an imposter. With shock getting the best of everyone, they all just continued to look at Jared and Debbie. Jared, darling, please. Debbie's eyes fluttered. You know I love lipsticks. Why don't you buy some for me, too? Underneath this whole act, Debbie felt as if she were beating herself up. Occasionally stealing glances towards Carlos, she grew more and more irritated. Why the hell isn't he leaving? Doesn't he know how hard this is to do on my end? Whatever. Let's see this through. Debbie Nian, for your freedom. Clenching her hands into balls of fists, Debbie was full of determination. If Carlos learns that I am his wife one day, he'll definitely think I have an affair with another man. Debbie had a smug look on her face. And with that, he'll think of me as a slut and immediately divorce me. A win-win situation for the both of us. That was now Debbie's grand plan, and there was no way she could afford to let that fail. Dragging her out from her thoughts was Jared, who groaned in resignation and exclaimed, Okay, I'll get you whatever you want, but just please. Jared's voice softened in despair. Please just stop acting like this. Absolutely no way did Jared take Debbie's show seriously, and he considered searching up for someone to wipe out this particular memory of his. Striding his way towards the lipstick display, Jared grabbed all of the lipsticks he saw and handed them all over to the saleslady. The saleslady was stunned at the amount of lipsticks Jared held in his hands. His hands are shaking, she thought. Didn't you hear me? Jared remarked. I want all of these now. The saleslady took whatever Jared had in his hands and hurried off to the counter. A heavy sigh escaped from his lips as Jared pinched the bridge of his nose and thought, I'm definitely going to get her brain checked. Only one person in that area knew what was going on, and it was Emmett. She's clearly doing it on purpose. However, he had something more pressing to handle at the moment, which was to heed his boss, Carlos' order of sending Debbie out. Wasn't Debbie his wife? There was no way Emmett could do such a thing. Upon recovering from the humiliation she had received earlier, Olga turned to Emmett and asked sternly, Emmett, why aren't you following Mr. Huo's orders? Clearly, Carlos is doing that to please me. Olga uttered to herself rather confidently. I must be different from other women in Carlos' eyes.
I'm truly blessed.
But sir. Emmett hesitated, but he knew he has to say it. She's your... Meeting Emmett's eyes was a glare clearly dyed with murderous intent if ever he continue his statement. Immediately, Emmett commanded the bodyguards that lingered behind him, Get them out! Finally, the moment Debbie had been waiting for arrived. Right after Emmett had given his command, Debbie raised her hand up, preventing the bodyguards doing what they were tasked to do, and said, No need for that. We'll show ourselves out. Now approaching the exit, Debbie turned to Jared, who was about to pay for the lipsticks at the counter, and said, Hey, no need for the lipsticks. Let's get going. Almost immediately, Jared reeled back the credit card he was about to hand over to the saleslady. Collecting the lipsticks from the counter, he made it a point to place them back at the display booth. Once he was done, Debbie and her friends exited the store. As Carlos watched Debbie's figure recede into the distance, a look of grimace and suspicion was present on his profile. Something feels off, he thought. Casting a scornful glance upon Debbie's figure, Olga turned to Carlos and beamed charmingly. Clinging to his arm once again, she suggested in a pleasant voice, Mr. Huo, how about we have dinner on the 5th floor of the Alioth building? Surely after that detestable scenario, you must be famished. All right, Carlos responded indifferently. Let's get going. Shaking off the speculations he had inside his mind, Emmett cleared the way and escorted his boss out of the store. At the exit of the Merak building, Debbie abruptly turned heel and looked at Jared asking, Hey, I remember you wanting to have lunch on the 5th floor of the Alioth building. Am I right? Tomboy, are you seriously pulling my legs right now? Jared signed. To be very honest with you, I've spent all of my money on mobile games, so there's no way I can afford to buy you dinner on... Debbie clapped her hands together and smiled. Then, why don't I treat you guys to lunch instead? The eyes surrounding Debbie widened like plates. Wanting to add more fuel to the fire, Jared leaned against Dixon, who stood behind him. Feigning a terrified voice, he placed a hand over his mouth. "Oh my, doctor, is Tomboy, is she going crazy? Who would have thought that being a well-rounded brilliant student came with disadvantages?" Dixon still couldn't wrap his mind around it. Often, Jared loved to banter with Dixon and call him doctor. Though, this time Dixon's concern fell with Jared's statement, as Dixon did also agree that Debbie was acting quite odd today. On the other hand, Casey was completely calm and collected at the situation unfolding. Kicking Jared on his foot, Casey eyed him and scolded, "Hey, Debbie's still a girl. Girls are supposed to be spoiled, and it is normal for us to act spoiled, so get used to it." Shifting her gaze to everyone in the room, Casey continued, "Besides, Tomboy uses $1 million car to go to places. I'd say that having dinner on the 5th floor of the Alioth building is something normal for her to do. So why do you have such surprised looks on your faces?" Only then did Jared realize Casey had made a compelling point. Standing up from his spot and straightening out his clothes, Jared then began, "Sure, she may be able to afford the place, but you know, the 5th floor of the Alioth building requires reservations. We can't just barge in there. Besides, it's also lunchtime already. Even if we were allowed to step in, I'm sure there'd be no tables available for us." Never did Jared intend to belittle Debbie. He merely disclosed the truth. Every time Jared's father needed to entertain and welcome distinguished clients on the 5th floor of the Alioth building, he made sure to file a reservation at least 1 week, sometimes even 3 months prior to the client's arrival. While the rest were indulging themselves in chatter, Debbie looked preoccupied. Even before she had met Carlos, the title of Mrs. Huo had never meant anything to her. Until now, the moment when Debbie saw Carlos with another woman in public, it made her uneasy. To add, he seemed to spend money lavishly on that woman as well. It came to Debbie's attention that the lipstick set Carlos had bought the woman was worth $130,000. The other commodities in the bags Emmett had carried probably cost tens or hundreds of thousands each. Not once being petty nor frugal with Debbie, Carlos had always given her a hefty amount for her monthly allowance, though she insisted she only take a portion as she was still a student and there was no such need for her to carry such a huge amount of money with her. The rest of the money was then deposited by Philip, and from there, Debbie never inquired about anything else afterwards. It never hit Debbie to indulge herself into buying such expensive commodities such as a lipstick set. However, Carlos had bought that lipstick set for the woman with him as soon as the woman uttered that she wanted it. Considering this, why should she, his wife, be frugal at every angle of her life just to save a penny? On another thought, since a divorce was about to split the two, why didn't she enjoy the life of Mrs. Huo when she still could? Glancing towards her group of friends who were still absorbed in going to the 5th floor of the Alioth building, Debbie thought that all of them deserved a delectable meal. A little lunch for all of them wouldn't hurt. Debbie chuckled to herself. It's decided. They're all getting lunch. Taking out her phone from her pocket, Debbie then dialed Philip's number and pressed the phone against her ear to talk. A minute after, the call between Debbie and Philip ended. Turning to her friends as she placed her phone back in her pocket, she cleared her throat deliberately, which succeeded in catching everyone's attention. All eyes were now on her and they all looked at her curiously. "Well, why re all of you just standing there?" Debbie asked as she turned her heel, already talking towards the exit. "We have to get going." All looked at one another, then to Debbie. One spoke up in response. It was Christina. Wondering cautiously, Christina asked, "Where exactly are we going?" Turning her head to face Christina and the crowd, Debbie answered with a grin on her profile. "To the 5th floor of the Alioth building, of course. Wouldn't you like to have an exquisite lunch there?" On the 5th floor of the Alioth building, Debbie was patiently waiting for their private booth to be confirmed. When the elevator doors opened, Debbie's attention fell to the man stepping off of the elevator. The said man was hard to miss, as the man had an aura oozing with intimidation and arrogance. The man's presence was completely overbearing. Damn, it's him again. Debbie placed a hand against her chest, bitter. Before her proposal for a divorce, it took her more than once in a blue moon to be able to meet such a man of power. Although, ever since Debbie had inquired Philip to hand Carlos the divorce papers, it was as if the universe had made it so much easier to meet. This was perhaps their 3rd meeting already. Mind going haywire with the possibility of this man purposely creating such coincidences, Debbie thought that this was maybe his effort to save their marriage. "Who let these people here?" Carlos' voice boomed in anger. "Throw them out." With a voice that strong, Debbie snapped out from her trail of thoughts and her attention fell onto the situation beginning to unfold. The floor manager was as pale as a sheet of paper. He took a deep breath and answered, "Mr. Huo, these are Philip's guests." Upon hearing Philip's name uttered, Carlos sent a cold glance onto the college students. "Emmett, they can all stay except her." Emmett knew exactly whom Carlos was referring to. Someone was desperate to keep her laughter in check, and it was none other than Olga. It amused her when she heard of Carlos' impassive order. "He must love me so much that he'd do this for me," she thought to herself as she looked at Carlos dreamily. "He's the best. Why is Mr. Huo treating Mrs. Huo this way?" Emmett pondered upon himself. Why does he despise her so much? These kinds of thoughts continued to consume Emmett, now in a standstill. With a minute about to pass, Carlos noticed that Emmett still did not do his task. It was then as if the word patience had never existed within Carlos. A grim look was cast towards Emmett's direction. It belonged to none other than Carlos. So, you can't even handle such a small task? And no, Mr. Huo, it's not like that at all. Emmett grew flustered. As she's aware of what Emmett was about to utter from his lips, Debbie winked at him, sincerely hoping that he wouldn't reveal her identity. Yet, Debbie was caught in action as Carlos saw a glimpse of her gestures and, in his eyes, it seemed as if she was making sheep's eyes towards Emmett. Huh, so she is involved with Emmett too, Carlos sneered inwardly. He shifted his gaze towards Emmett, his tone somber and full of warning. Emmett, looks can be deceptive. Some people may portray an angel on the outside, but on the inside, a demon covered in filth resides within them. If I were to be such a person, I would be too ashamed to even breathe and willingly jump off this building. Those remarks didn't help Emmett gain clarity at all as confusion continued to strike him down. Why is Mr. Huo holding such a grudge towards a young girl? Emmett kept asking himself. And why would he make such hostile remarks in public about her? As far as Emmett knew, Carlos made it clear that he never entertained the idea of building connections with women. Someone knew whom that snide remark Carlos made was aimed at. It was none other than Debbie, and it just further fueled her rage. None of the people who had attempted to cross her had benefited from their acts. There was absolutely no way Debbie would let them win. The blood rushed to her head. She spat in a taunting manner. Oh, grow up, Carlos Huo. Why do you have to act like a child? That kiss was a mere accident. Taking steps closer, Debbie continued. You've already thrown me out once and here you are, about to do it, again. Why are you acting as if you own this place? Ha! Who do you exactly think you are? There was truth to Debbie's words. Although Debbie had kissed Carlos, it was ultimately still her loss as that was her first kiss. Yeah, Carlos was her husband. What of it? None of that bothered Debbie at all. Having lost something as precious as a first kiss infuriated her. Women cared for these details, after all. Christina and Jared tugged at Debbie's sleeves, preventing Debbie from speaking further. Whoa, slow down there, tomboy. Chill. Mr. Huo's a man of power. We shouldn't mess with him? Jared whispered in Debbie's ear, hoping to knock some sense into her. Still, what Carlos had done was unforgivable. Despite being a man of power, no one, absolutely no one, had the liberty to degrade a person like that. There was no way Debbie was taking the verbal abuse silently. Since you say I am a filthy woman, then that kiss would definitely have fouled you. Debbie eyed Carlos, her tone full of intent on mocking him. So, if I should die, are you willing to die with me, Mr. Almighty? Technically, they were still married. If they were just a normal couple, that would have sounded romantic and wooed a lot of people. The whole venue fell in utter silence upon Debbie's snide remarks on Carlos. The crowd has started to talk among themselves. Who'd even dare to try and kiss Carlos Huo? Rather, who in the right mind would even ask him to go die right in front of his face? As the scene continued to unfold, the floor manager wanted to take things into his own hands despite knowing that Debbie might get him lose his job. As the floor manager saw Emmett unmoving, he threw his idea away. Emmett knew Carlos better than him after all. Quiche. When the four-letter word left Debbie's lips, Olga clenched her jaw as she glared at Debbie in resentment. If only Olga could, she'd strip Debbie from her clothing and have her fed to the sharks. If it weren't for Olga's grandfather, she wouldn't have been able to stand beside Carlos. Even I haven't kissed him, Olga thought to herself, screaming in frustration as she did so. Just asking to link arms with Carlos would use so much of my courage, and yet this girl kissed him. Finally, Emmett failed to contain his emotions and covered his face with both his hands, utterly speechless. Could Debbie be more ignorant? Shining International Plaza indeed belonged to Mr. Huo, and while the divorce still hadn't gone though, Carlos and Debbie were still to be considered a married couple. Legally speaking, whatever Carlos owned, Debbie owned it too. Casey had eyed Carlos with the widest grin on her face since the moment her eyes fell on Carlos. Heart pounding in excitement, her body grew in heat. God. She knew she was looking at a meal and it was just waiting to be devoured. Snapping her out from her indecent thoughts was Debbie's last remark. Clearing her throat, Casey then raised her point, rather hesitantly as well. Hey tomboy, Shining International Plaza is actually owned by Mr. Huo. You know? An obnoxious sneer crept up to Olga's profile as she laughed at Debbie. What an ignorant girl. Tell you what, the entire Shining International Plaza is Mr. Huo's. Turning to glance towards Casey, Debbie stared at her blankly while Casey closed her eyes and lowered her head, heavily sighing. Debbie, I don't even know how I'm going to help you this time. You've clearly insulted Mr. Huo so many times. Lifting her head up to look at Debbie, Casey shook her head. I'm afraid I can't help you out this time. Even if I decide to put my life on the line. Debbie glanced around the whole venue. Her eyes then took in the opulent view around her. Everything dazzled in riches. From antique paintings, precious artifacts, to state-of-the-art furniture. Doesn't that mean I technically own this place as well? A wide smirk took up Debbie's profile. Then she roared with laughter. All eyes were on Debbie as if she were a lunatic that had just escaped from a hospital. The crowd came to an agreement that there was definitely something wrong with her. Only Emmett knew the reason why Debbie had started to act that way. So, you finally realized that you're also a boss of this plaza? The amount of wealth the shining International Plaza would bring would have made some people go crazy with ecstasy. However, Debbie didn't let that thought get the best of her. Upon seeing Debbie like that, Jared felt as if Debbie's body had been taken over by some evil spirit. Stepping in once again, he bent down, swept her body up from the floor and began to carry her upon his shoulder. With her head upside down, Debbie began to observe that the floor had started to turn rickety, and in a few minutes, her head started to spin. Only then did she fully grasp what was really happening. She immediately yelled in disapproval, "Hey, Jared, what the hell are you doing?" Ignoring Debbie's statements, Jared continued to carry her. "Put me down. I can't let that pig speak ill of me like that," she exclaimed. If Jared wasn't going to put her down, Debbie knew she could still win by having the last word. "You got to do this, Debbie," she said to herself in determination. "You got to say everything to his hideous face. Frighten him by pushing through the divorce. Suggest it to him if he prefers to go to the Civil Affairs Department right now to get it done immediately. Say it." Wearing a smile full of chutzpah, Debbie lifted her head up and pointed at Carlos, holding him in utter contempt. "Now, you listen here, Car MPH." Casey placed her hand over Debbie's mouth to stop her words being further spilled, in case she added fuel to the fire. Flashing Carlos a smile, Casey humbly apologized. "We are terribly, terribly sorry, Mr. Huo. Our friend here's a bit crazy today. We'll be taking our leave. Again, we're absolutely sorry for the ruckus our friend has made." All the others did the same and apologized. So did Christina and Dixon, which got Debbie fuming. "We're deeply sorry for such a scene, Mr. Huo. We'll be taking our leave." They then took the elevator and left the venue. With Jared still carrying Debbie on his shoulder, they received awkward glances as they made their way down to the underground parking lot. Reaching Jared's Mercedes car, Debbie was finally put down to her feet. Only then did Jared finally manage to breathe. We ought to take Tomboy to a mental hospital," Jared panted. Exhaustion was present on his body as he had to carry Debbie to prevent her from doing anything that could get them into further trouble. "We should try to contact the president of that hospital," Jared continued amidst catching his breath, "and say we have a special case that needs to be attended to immediately." With Jared's body finally giving up, he let himself fall onto the concrete floor and sit down to catch his breath. Silence dawned upon the group as all eyes pitted Jared as he did the hard work of carrying Debbie all the way down to the parking lot. When everyone thought that Debbie wouldn't do anything else, they were wrong. The dizzy Debbie pushed herself off of the car and held the exhausted Jared against his collar. Debbie raised her hand up, intending to slap him. "I'll send you to a mental hospital." Before Debbie's hand could land and strike Jared across his cheek, Casey tightly gripped it.
No, Debbie.
This time, Jared's right. You do need to be sent to a mental hospital. There's definitely something up with you. Taking her hand back from Casey's grip, Debbie also released Jared from her grasp. Casey continued, "You do know who you were talking to, right? That was Mr. Huo. For Christ's sake." Right after Casey had finished her statement, she then placed her hands together and mumbled, as if chanting to the spirits, "Please don't let Mr. Huo kill us. Please don't let Mr. Huo kill us." Leaning against the car, Debbie placed her right hand on her forehead in irritation. "I'm going home. I'll cut school this afternoon." "You're cutting school again?" Dixon sent Debbie a glare of disapproval. They had been classmates for quite a long time, and it frustrated Dixon to find out that Debbie remained unchanged, uninfluenced. Even after so many years, she still despised studying. It hurt Dixon as he hoped he had an influence towards Debbie, as Dixon followed the saying that goes, "With the good, we become good." Opening the door of the Mercedes, Debbie threw herself into the driver's seat. "Yes, Dixon," she responded. Again, there was no trace of embarrassment or remorse in her tone. "Hey, Ja," she shook her head. "No, wait, Jared's car cost more than Casey's. I should just borrow hers instead." Leaning her head out of the car, Debbie called to Casey, "Hey, Casey, I'm going to have to borrow your car this afternoon." Taking out her car keys, Casey headed over to Debbie, but before handing the keys over, she had concern all over her face when she looked at Debbie. "Tomboy, are you sure you're okay? How could I tell my friends that Carlos is my husband? Hell, they won't believe me." Debbie thought to herself, "It might even further convince my friends to send me to a mental hospital and say I finally snapped." Nodding her head, Debbie answered Casey in reassurance. "I'm fine. The heat just got to my head. Also, don't worry. Mr. Huo won't make trouble for us." All Debbie wanted to do right now was head straight home and talk to Carlos face to face regarding their divorce. Taking out her phone, Debbie then typed down Carlos' number and started to compose a text message. "Carlos, I want a divorce. You only have 1 day left before you come back and settle the matter." Reading through the message again, Debbie thought it came on too arrogant. What if he goes after my friends? I already pushed his buttons. Yep, I should change it. Taking a deep breath, Debbie then started to compose another message. "Mr. Huo, please don't make trouble for my friends. I am sorry for what happened today. I'll divorce you as soon as possible. If you are free today, why don't we head to the Civil Affairs Department and file the divorce?" Pausing as she typed, Debbie thought to herself, "Why am I apologizing? It's not my fault. Also, I'm pissed at him too." Staring at her phone long and hard, conflicted about what message to send, Debbie eventually gave up on this idea and decided to just call Philip once again. Hello, Philip. Yes. Could I ask for Emmett's phone number? She asked over the phone. As Emmett was Carlos' assistant, he must know something. Once Philip had mailed Emmett's digits over to Debbie, she proceeded to call him. When Emmett received Debbie's call, he was in the middle of driving Olga home as his boss, Carlos, had instructed. He answered the call through his earpiece. Hello, Emmett. This is Debbie. Hearing this, Emmett glanced at Olga, who was sitting in the passenger's seat. He cleared his throat and greeted, Hi, Mrs. Huo. Sure enough, Emmett's greeting immediately caught Olga's attention. No, I don't want to be Mrs. Huo anymore, so I'd like for you to stop addressing me as that, Debbie responded. About that, Emmett started. Since the divorce isn't decided yet, according to courtesy, I should keep addressing you as Mrs. Huo. The line fell silent for a brief moment until Debbie groaned. Fine, but, hey, can I ask you something? Mr. Huo's not irritated with my friends, is he? Did he order you to get rid of me or any of my friends? Recalling what his boss Carlos had told him before they left, Emmett then responded, No, Mr. Huo just asked me to send Miss Me home and investigate her. It struck Emmett strange. Normally, if Carlos abhorred someone so much, he would immediately ask Emmett to get rid of them. But with Debbie, he only asked him to investigate her. Did Carlos find Debbie charming? Was Carlos attracted? All men couldn't resist a beautiful woman after all. It was difficult for women to look good even without makeup, and so far, Debbie succeeded without even trying. It would only be natural if Carlos fancied her. Upon hearing Emmett's answer, Debbie sighed heavily. Could you send me his company address? To save Emmett from some trouble, Debbie decided to take things into her hands and search for Carlos on her own and have a decent talk with him about the matter. Following Debbie's orders, Emmett sent her the information she needed. When I reach the company, just feign you don't know me. It'd be bad for me if Carlos drags you into our problem. Debbie pleaded. Okay, that man seemed petty. How tolerant could Carlos be since he had just held a strong grudge against Debbie for just one measly kiss? It was difficult to fathom how he would react if he learned that Emmett had known who Debbie really was this whole time. Emmett was hesitant to agree. The other side of the call had expected that Emmett was to act that way with her request. Emmett, if you turn me down, I won't get divorced, Debbie stated. And one day, I'll have to tell Mr. Huo that it was your idea to hide my identity from him. Mrs. Huo.
I'm sorry, Emmett.
I have no choice, Debbie added. Let me treat you to a nice dinner next time. Okay? If Emmett were to help Debbie pursue her personal endeavors, she would be eternally grateful. But it didn't exactly sit well with Emmett to be threatened by girl. Signing, Emmett resigned to Debbie's request. What a lovely yet spunky girl, Emmett thought to himself. Surely such a girl should be the cold boss's type. In order to make sure that his boss, Carlos, wouldn't lose such a unique girl, Emmett decided he should do something to help. While the whole conversation continued, it was as if Emmett had forgotten that Olga was also in the vehicle. Dying to know who Mrs. Huo was, Olga couldn't remain still in her seat. The moment the call ended, Olga immediately shot Emmett a question. Emmett, was that Mrs. Huo? She asked, intending to conceal her urgency as she feigned a tone of ignorance. However, Emmett knew that wasn't the case at all, as Olga was obviously agitated. When Emmett only responded with silence, Olga egged him on with her questions. Who is she? Tell me her name. Switching off the earpiece, Emmett responded, his tone serious. I'm sorry, Miss Me. This is Mr. Huo's personal affair. It's not my place to talk about it. If you are interested about it, you may ask Mr. Huo yourself. Ask Mr. Huo? One could only wish to have the nerve to ask about such things. I see. All right, Olga said in a deadpan tone. I'll take note of that. Smiling bitterly, she turned to look at the car window, obviously fuming at Emmett's response and attitude. Even if she did possess the nerve to ask, it'd just be ridiculous to inquire about a man's wife. Not to mention, that wasn't just any man, it was Mr. Huo. The very next day, Emmett arrived at Carlos' office with a few sheets of paper in hand that contained all the information he could gather regarding Debbie, which was an application form from her university and a simple profile. The said profile only ranged with basic information such as age, university, and hobbies. Placing them on Carlos' desk, Emmett took a few steps back and waited for his boss' response. Picking up the papers from the desk, Carlos skimmed them, and what surprised Emmett was Carlos suddenly tossed them up in the air. He looked at Emmett in frustration, his voice booming throughout his office. Is this all that you're capable of? Have I been too good to you recently? Such a sullen tone sent Emmett's heart pounding fiercely. Keeping himself calm and composed, Emmett bent down to pick up the papers and took the chance to take a deep breath. Once he did, he responded, Mr. Huo, this girl is an enigma. This is all the information I could gather so far. A lie escaped Emmett's lips. In reality, he had shredded the rest of the papers and disposed of it. Get lost, Carlos commanded. Now. Yes, Mr. Huo. Giving one last glance at the papers which Carlos had swept off his desk, Emmett fled his boss' office as quickly as possible. When his office doors had reached a full close, Carlos' eyes fell to the image on the application form. In that image he saw, Debbie was free from any trace of makeup. Catching his attention, Once more was Debbie's pair of round, glistening eyes. Strange to say, Carlos felt as if Debbie's eyes were speaking to him. Then that displeasing memory crossed his mind again. That memory of how Debbie had kissed him. Instantly, he felt offended all over again. Rubbing his brows, he picked up a file from his desk and slammed it against Debbie's application form. The image of Debbie was instantly covered up and out of Carlos' view, in which he felt he had hit Debbie across the face. Now he felt better. While Carlos eased himself once again into his seat to relax, a certain piece of information struck him once again. Sitting up from his seat, he gravely pondered. Her last name, Nian. Only a few people in Y City have that last name. What's her relationship with the Nian family? Disrupting Carlos from his trail of thought was none other than the phone ringing on his desk. Sighing, he picked up the call. It was autumn and the maple leaves along Maple Road in Debbie's university were taking on the color of scarlet. Walking along the now red leaf path, Debbie was with low spirits, not in the mood to appreciate the beauty of the season, while the two people by her side, Jared and Casey, were happily frolicking against the fallen leaves. 2 days had already passed and still, Debbie failed to muster up the courage to head to Carlos' office and speak with him regarding their divorce. Not one word had come from him. During the previous evening, Philip had informed her that Carlos hadn't attended to the matter yet, which bothered her immensely. Alas, all of this had sprung from that one text she received a long time ago. Debbie, I'm coming back. The man that she had given her heart to told her that he had successfully graduated overseas and was returning to the country to take over his father's position. Though, as Debbie thought about it now, what part of it concerned her? The Epsilon B.N. A universe of stories awaits. It was the man that had told her to forget about him. That time, she had grown so vexed that she ended up agreeing to marry Carlos, whom she hadn't met even once back then. Now, he told her out of the blue that he was returning. It irritated Debbie as she couldn't help but be fixated on the reason why he had even told her about his return in the first place. This information was useless for her as she didn't even want to know. Mind drowned in heaps of questions, Debbie disliked the feeling. Art, this is so annoying. All eyes fell onto her curiously as she had suddenly yelled out her frustration in the open. Debbie, what did I ever do to you? A small voice responded. What made you say I'm annoying? Then a yelp was heard. Ah! A girl collapsed on the ground in front of Debbie. Stopping in her tracks, Debbie decided to take a closer look at the girl, and the moment she did, she rolled her eyes in disgust. What the hell? This hypocritical, manipulative bitch again. Debbie cursed internally. The hell does she want now? Sprawling on the ground was Jail Moo. Well, Jail wasn't her real name as it was Gail Moo. Though, Debbie preferred to call her Jail, as she thought it suited her better. No clue as to how Gail had actually fallen. Debbie looked at her with utter contempt. In a long, white dress, hair tumbling down to her waist. A perfect image of what a pure, innocent, and delicate girl would be. Who could possibly be a better master of disguise than Gail Moo? Beat it, Debbie hissed. Get out of my way. Just the mere sight of Gail Moo churned her stomach. Wasting her breath on her wasn't Debbie's thing. Rather, she didn't even want to breathe the same air as her. The hell? Debbie thought to herself. We didn't even bump into each other. Oh, is this bitch really planning to mess with me right now? However, Gail Moo's eyes reddened. The boys that formed a crowd around the scene and expected a catfight already felt sorry for Gail Moo. They all cast angry looks towards Debbie, but kept themselves silent. No one in the whole economics and management school was stupid enough to dare even place a finger upon Debbie. Debbie, you knocked me over and you didn't even have the decency to apologize?
Gail Moo feigned tears.
You even told me to beat it. How can you be such a bully? A boy who incidentally saw the sight understood immediately what was occurring and just couldn't stand the thought of being unable to do anything. He walked over and offered a hand to help Gail Moo to her feet. Smiling against her tears, Gail Moo thanked the boy. His face similar to the color of the leaves in the season, he fled away from the scene. You freak, Debbie exclaimed, pointing towards Gail Moo. Go to a hospital and have your brain checked. Attempting to walk away from the situation only to be blocked by Gail Moo once again clearly started to set Debbie off. Leaning forward ever so slightly towards Debbie, Gail Moo spoke to her in an arrogant tone. Since you hate me so much, why don't we have a bet? Eyes turning dark, she continued. If I lose, I'll make sure to never cross paths with you ever again. How does that sound? Wearing a pitiful expression and lowering her voice, Gail Moo easily deceived the crowd by making them think that she was apologizing to Debbie. That was not what was happening. Is there even a brain in that skull of yours? Debbie questioned. Why would I take such a bet? Show up wherever you like. I don't own the school. Rather, I don't really give a damn. What are you saying that you won't even go home? Oh please, give me a break. Of course I will. I'll start making myself disappear the moment you head home, Gail responded brashly. How about it, Debbie Nian? Bullshit, Debbie exclaimed. I have no time for this. Move and go away now or else you'll regret it. Sensing Debbie's foul mood, Gail Moo knew she had to settle the matter quicker. Instantly coming up with a new idea, Gail Moo began again. I know you hate me and you know yourself I hate you more. So, why don't we just run a marathon and bet on it? Throwing her arm to the side, Gail Moo continued to provoke Debbie. I mean, you are good at running, or are you? Psychological tactics always worked like a charm on Debbie, and Gail Mu knew that very well. Half marathon? Debbie scoffed. No problem. I always do well in running. I'm obviously going to win, she thought to herself. Maybe it isn't too bad after all, not having to see Gail Mu forever. Also, it's a good channel to let out my frustration too. Without even thinking, she accepted Gail Mu's proposition, allotting no time for Jared to even stop her. Nonetheless, what Debbie did not know was that a former silver medalist athlete was going to take part in the race as well. How exactly was she going to fare against a professional athlete? Glancing at Gail Mu, Debbie asked, "What would you get if you win?" Stiffing her smile, Gail Mu took another step toward Debbie. "If I win." Back in the dormitory, after securing the fees for the half marathon she had agreed on with Gail Mu, Debbie threw herself onto the bed and buried her face in pillow. How could I let anger get the best of me and get swayed by Gail Mu's bait? She scolded herself as she gritted her teeth. I should have known better than that. That bitch just showed up all of a sudden. So obviously there must be a reason why she's doing this. And if she had devised a scheme, she's obviously prepared. Violently shifting positions around her own bed in frustration. Debbie then stopped and looked at the ceiling, her expression full of conviction. Fine, you want to play that way, Gail Mu? Then I'll be glad to play. On another note, she really needed to keep her head cool next time. The second after she signed up for the half marathon, Debbie learned that if she failed to place first at the race, she would have to chase Gus Liu, another man blessed with wealth, as he was the second son of the boss of the Liu group. No one on the campus obviously missed the signs. The signs that Gus Liu was gay. With how he carried himself, how could anyone have missed them? Certainly, Gail Mu was attempting to humiliate Debbie. And if Debbie lost, her second choice was to lock up one of the most powerful people in the university, their very own principal Curtis Liu, in his very own office. Either of the choices offered was bad. Thus, Debbie chose neither. Among all the principals in their university, Curtis Liu, the elder son of the Liu family, took charge of all things regarding management. Pissing off a principal was the last thing she wanted, where adventures await between lines. Nonetheless, Debbie clicked her tongue. Compared to the principals of other universities who were in their 50s, their principal Curtis was really appealing. Being only 30, Curtis had already been working as one of the principals of the university for 2 years. That went with the fact that he had gained plenty of admirers. How wouldn't you fall for someone with such charming looks and stellar competency? If Debbie were to be in opposition towards Curtis, her list of archenemies would lengthen, and she didn't want that. Furthermore, he was one of Carlos' confidants, and just like him, Curtis was also part of the 4 wealthiest families in Y City. Messing with any person who had contact or relations with Carlos meant trouble for her. Comfortingly, Jared and her other friends had signed up for the half marathon too. It lightened her heart to know that she wouldn't be alone throughout the whole race. Speaking of 13.1 miles, Debbie turned sour. Oh God. Why did I let my anger get the best of me? Debbie sighed deeply. I feel like I'm going to die, and I'm sure I will. Then, what Gail had said to her echoed inside her mind. You know, there's always another way if you don't want to race. You can just shout, Carlos, I love you, 10 times, and then I'll let you off, Gail had told her. Groaning, Debbie presumed that this had to be one of Gail's dirty tricks she had come up with after she had learned about Carlos' burning hatred for women. A sadistic plan, indeed. Carefully deliberating upon the 3 choices Gail had given her, she ended up choosing one. Finally came the day of the race, and the skies took on a shade of gray. Wearing the marathon shirt along with her friends, Debbie was warming up before the event started. When she and her friends saw a former silver medalist of the full marathon appear on the track, their mouths gaped. They were screwed. This is bad. This is really, really bad. All chorused in anxiety. Gail Mu. Debbie gritted her teeth. I'll remember this. That bitch, Jared cursed, agitated. How dare she play us like this? I'll let her know who exactly she's dealing with. Silence dawned upon Debbie as she was furious at Gail, but mostly herself. If anger had not gotten the best of her, none of this would be happening. Not just falling for Gail's rotten scheme, she ended up also dragging her friends into it. Feeling a hand on her shoulder, Debbie saw Casey beaming. Hey, just don't push yourself, alright? If you can't go on, stop. We can always just go for the second option to lock up the principal. It's no big deal. This time, Casey weighed Debbie's options herself. The first was definitely ruled out. There was no way Debbie would chase after Gus. As for the third, Casey shook her head in disapproval. No. With what happened at the mall, I don't think it'd even be a good idea to consider. The best option was to keep Debbie away from Carlos. With 2 out of 3 crossed out, only the one regarding Curtis remained. But dealing with Curtis wasn't any easier. What kinds of stupid choices are these? Casey stated angrily. This should be considered harassment. Embracing Casey, Debbie remarked. Don't worry. I've won other races, though the distances weren't so long. I'm sure I can make it this time. Besides, it's also my first time running a half marathon. So why don't I make the most of it? The humiliation of Debbie was Gail's goal, but sadly that would never happen. Besides, Debbie continued as she released Casey. Gail Mu is the last person I'd never want to lose to. Tomboy. No matter what everyone else says, you're my hero, Christina declared. I have faith in you. The number of trophies Debbie had won really blew her mind.
Playfully blowing Christina kiss, Debbie confidently grinned.
I have faith in myself too. Now, let's get to our positions and win this thing. Yeah, the group stuck together and stayed in their assigned positions. Having finalized their lineup, only then did they take easy. Everyone knew that having an effective lineup might alleviate the difficulty of attaining victory. More than 6,000 runners had signed up for this half marathon, and there were 500 volunteers. Acquaintances of the runners participating in this half marathon from nearby universities had come to cheer and support for them. Various fans had appeared at the venue as well, fans of the former Olympic winner, some superstars, and the silver medalist of the full marathon. Either side of the track at the starting line was taken over by a sea of people coming over to cheer. Officially starting off the event, a host entered and gave the opening remarks. To all guests, runners, referees at the venue, good morning. On this beautiful day, we all gather here in the new district of Y City. The host droned on with his speech and Debbie grew drowsy. Next, the deafening sound of the whistle reverberated throughout the track. All shot forward and dashed. Waves of cheers rang in the air. All supported their own favorite. Unexpectedly, there were people who were rooting for Debbie. Go, Debbie, go. You can do it, Debbie. Upon hearing her name being chanted, Debbie turned to see 10-odd classmates of hers had turned up to support her. Whoa, look at our classmates today, Jared said in awe. They're doing amazing. Sure they are, Christina replied as she glanced at Dixon. Clearly, you and the class monitor had given them orders. Who dare not heed your orders? There was no need to lie. The two of them did request people to come and cheer. Ugh! Come on, Christina, Jared bleated. Would it kill you to keep it a secret? Elevated by the gesture, Debbie patted both Jared and Dixon on their backs. Thanks, guys. I'll do my best. I won't let you guys down. Tomboy, don't pressure yourself. Dixon voiced his concern. Even if you lose, we'll be right there for you whether you select saying, I like you, to Gus or locking Mr. Liu in his office. Considering the unpleasant events that occurred between her and Carlos, Dixon didn't think Debbie would consider the third choice. All right, I'll keep that in mind, Debbie commented. You guys better live up to your words as you'll be with me when I say, I like you to Gus. Having such good-hearted friends are hard to come by, and Debbie felt incredibly lucky to have them by her side. Right on, tomboy, Casey interjected with a grin. Take both of them with you, and maybe Gus will find one of them handsome, and he'll forget all about you. That triggered the girls' titter. Meanwhile, Dixon and Jared rushed over to Casey and raised their fist high. A scream escaped from Casey's lips. Distracted, they failed to hear that the gun was fired. All runners already got a head start. The first one to act was Christina, then all followed suit after. Run! Christina burst out. We're already behind. Placing first within their group was Casey. Closing in behind her was Jared. What came over to you to feed Debbie such a feeble idea, Casey? Jared huffed. You better run faster, because you'll be dead meat if I catch up. Hey, we just started. Debbie pulled Jared's shirt. Slow down. You'd be tired in few moments if you keep this up. Winning doesn't just rely on sheer luck. You have to consider strategy as well. As a person who loved sports, Debbie knew that starting with a full sprint was a terrible idea. Half an hour transpired. The runners that had previously had so much energy now had close to none. Most weren't even running, but walking. Inside the VIP lounge of the university, a haughty man smoked a cigarette as he spectated the live broadcast of the half marathon in front of a widescreen television. Design collection for Y City half marathon event from the star of Y City design contest, including the designs for the poster, the eco-friendly bag, and the official mascot. Mr. Huo, are all of these okay? Tristan Zhang, one of Carlos' assistants, inquired after completing his report. Being the biggest sponsor of the event, Carlos remained impassive, with his lips pressed. While standing with his head courteously tilted down, Tristan waited for an answer, but not a peep was heard from his boss even after a long moment. When he raised his head in confusion to check what was going on, he noticed that the cigarette in his boss' hand had mostly burned into ash. What remained in his grip was the cigarette butt, but Carlos had yet to realize it. His eyes were glued on the screen. Out of curiosity, Tristan turned his head towards the TV. A girl was taking the lead of the marathon. The young lady wore a green t-shirt and sneakers sponsored by Carlos' company, ZL Group. Although her t-shirt was soaking wet from all the running, her pace was steady. Her face, on the other hand, was as red as a ripe apple. It was so adorable. One careful glance, and a person would be tempted to give it a little pinch. At least, that was what Tristan felt as he found himself watching and silently cheering for the athlete. Repeat your report. From the top, Carlos suddenly demanded, giving Tristan quite a start. When Tristan turned around to reiterate his report, his boss had already averted his gaze from the screen. Once again, his head was buried in a file, his eyes hidden from view, as though he was never distracted. After some time, the one-time silver medalist managed to surpass Debbie. But this did not faze her, and 1 hour and 10 minutes later since the beginning, Debbie was ahead of everyone again. Everyone witnessed how much effort she put into each calculated step as she advanced forward. The whole venue was boiling with enthusiasm from every side. As she gained momentum, Some students from the economics and management school applauded her in excitement, shouting, "Well done, Debbie, keep it going. You're almost there," they yelled approvingly. Even the students who could not see everything clearly from a distance had joined in the cheering when they heard that Debbie was taking the lead again. Everything else was drowned out by the shouts, which came in waves, one louder than another. It went without saying that as much as she showed no signs of slowing down, neither did their screams of encouragement. 10 more minutes later, only 3 passes were left before they hit the finish line. All of a sudden, surprised exclamations came from the crowd. Amidst a mixture of reactions, some students shouted Dixon's name. When Debbie turned back, short of breath, she found that her friends, Jared and the rest, were nowhere to be seen. She realized that they had pulled out of the race. On the other hand, Dixon, who had been in the 6th place, had tripped for some reason. As he tried to get to his feet, it proved to be more difficult than he had thought, and he failed. Seeing this, Debbie hesitated for a second. Despite being several meters away from him, the distance growing with each step she took, she let out a low growl and then spun back towards him, sending the audience into a hysterical fit of amazement. The moment she made the call in that split second, the former silver medalist took the lead again in her stead. "Unravel the unknown. Unleash the unimaginable." "Tom," panted Dixon, sensing her return. "Tomboy, don't come back for me." But before he could string a few more words together, Debbie was already standing before him with an extended hand. Looking up with a pair of apologetic eyes, Dixon fell silent, his jaw slack. With a quick glance past Debbie's figure, he saw that the silver medalist was still finishing the race, and it brought his focus back. If not for him, he had to keep going for Debbie, who had risked what was possibly already a sure win for her. Resignedly, Dixon took her hand and got up. However, his injury seemed to be worse than he had thought. As soon as he stood up, the throb in his legs made him almost fall to his knees. Debbie was quick to catch him. "Tomboy, listen to me," he said between gasps. "My legs hurt." He shook his head, feeling defeated. I can't go on, but you can still go. Run. Just ignore me." Looking at the scratches on his knees, Debbie encouraged him. "Doctor, it's just a couple of scratches. You can do it. Just let me help you." They had been friends for years, and in those years, he never failed to be there for her when she got into trouble with the teachers. This time, however, he was the one who needed help. And like a true friend, she was not about to abandon him. With Debbie's stubborn insistence, Dixon clenched his teeth and started running again. It did not hurt as much, though, as Debbie supported him the entire time for the rest of the race. As their resilience was seen by everyone at the venue, the students screamed at the top of their lungs, "Monitor, Tomboy, you're awesome!" And somehow, a resounding voice stood out from the rest in the crowd. "Debbie, I love you." It was received with a lot of giggling and a few good-natured shaking heads, for it came from a girl. Despite being at a disadvantage, Debbie and Dixon gradually overtook some runners in front of them. Eventually, when they reached the finish line, Debbie came third, while Dixon was fourth. Although she did not come first, her decision to go back and help an injured friend engraved runner number 961's compassion in the hearts of everyone at the venue. Due to a decision that she made in split second, Debbie became a star, a hero. The man in the VIP lounge saw everything that happened in the race. Although he did not show it, the incident appeared to affect him in some way. The beloved female athlete was swarmed by a dozen boys. Out of elation, they carried her effortlessly with their hands, tossed her in the air, and caught her. They repeated this a few more times, and although she was helpless and exhausted, it brought a genuine smile on her face. Carlos sneered at the sight of it. "Look at her," he thought in annoyance. "Seducing those innocent boys. How flirty can she be?" After the race, Debbie retreated to her dorm and welcomed her bed with open arms. A lot had happened, but the day was not over yet. The closing ceremony of the half marathon was going to take place in a matter of hours, including an awarding for winners. What was more, the special guest to award the medals was the CEO of the ZL Group, Carlos. Upon hearing Carlos' name, she bounced up like a spring. "What?" Debbie could not help but shout out loud in disbelief. "Carlos?" She thought angrily. "Seriously, why is he everywhere?" The young lady brooded in her bed, obliviously biting her lip while deep in thought. Casting her a sympathetic look, Casey said, "I have to say, Debbie, Mr. Huo and you seem to have a special connection. It's like wherever you go, he appears to be there as well." Debbie sighed. "A special connection?" She could not help but snort. "He and I are, after all, legally bound together," she thought to herself. "Now I'm worried that it might get ugly between the two of you at the award ceremony," Casey was saying, as Debbie got out of her thoughts and looked at her. "I won't clash with him at the ceremony," assured Debbie. "Just that, well, who'd have thought that he'll be awarding the medals?" Huffing in a grumpy manner, she added, "Since I wasn't going to be the winner, I should have just let someone else take the third place. At least then I wouldn't have to see his face." Granted, third place was not bad, but as long as she did not place first, a part of her still felt that it was a loss nonetheless. She was just competitive that way, and coming third meant she had lost her bet with Gail. Blowing at her new polished nails, Christina chimed in, "Actually, Debbie, I envy you. How lucky you are to get to run into Mr. Huo so many times. He's so handsome, so rich. He's just everything. It's like fate. Then, the dreamy look which had been present on her face a moment ago disappeared. It was replaced by a pout as she continued. But when I think of how badly things ended every time you two saw each other, ugh, I'd rather not have such fate. Just like that, I don't envy you anymore. Only Debbie is bold enough to mess with Mr. Huo. Is her background more powerful than Mr. Huo's? There's no way that's possible. Shaking her head, Christina chased that thought away from her mind. In Y City, no one had dared to mess with Carlos except Debbie. Sluggishly clutching a cushion, Casey asked, "Tomboy, Mr. Huo is actually very handsome. I just don't understand why you're not attracted to him." She then tilted her head in a curious way and asked, "Why do you two hate each other so much?" The smile on Debbie's face faltered. The first time she had laid eyes on him, she was indeed attracted to his good looks. There was no doubt that the man was handsome. But later on, every time they saw each other, he managed to make it easy for her to dislike him. Why? Every time they met, he would run his mouth off, and his sarcasm would get on her nerves. Also, why on earth did he have to make such a fuss out of a kiss? When it came to kissing, should it not be the woman who was at a loss? She thought that as a man, he should not be so narrow-minded. On the other hand, he thought that as a woman, she should be more refined and less flirtatious. In a way, it appeared that they had gotten off on the wrong foot. Yet both seemed to be too stubborn to admit their flaws. "I don't understand," Debbie whined. "Why is he everywhere? Why does he even show up at the award ceremony of a marathon?" She rolled her eyes. "Does he not have to work somewhere? Isn't he some CEO of a multinational group? Shouldn't he have some company-related things to attend to? Why does he have the time to dilly-dally around?" After her rantings, Debbie folded her arms in anger and glared at nothing in particular. "Debbie, ZL Group is the biggest sponsor of this marathon," Casey told her. "They sponsored the clothes, sneakers, and the prizes. As the boss of ZL Group, of course, it's only natural that Mr. Huo is invited to the ceremony. Also, as ZL Group is keen on sport, they have sponsored a lot of sport meeting," Christina added. "It's not surprising at all to see ZL Group at marathon event." Even though Debbie believed them, she was still surprised by the fact that they knew so much. Both girls were often up to date on news regarding Carlos. In fact, most girls were. He was, after all, the richest bachelor in Y City. Only Debbie seemed to be repulsed by him at the moment, and given their status at Toshin, the irony was not lost on her. At the award ceremony, Debbie calmly stood on the third-place platform. When the crowd started to scream, she looked around and saw Carlos coming into sight. Wearing a suit and brand-new black leather shoes, the man got onto the stage at a steady pace. The autumn sun cast a golden hue on everything. In the sunlight, with his distinguished aura and elegant demeanor, he looked even more gorgeous than was usual. Every single woman off stage kept screaming in excitement. To her chagrin, even Debbie could not take her eyes off him for a while. If things stayed the way, if they did not argue at all, he would be so perfect. Unobtainable, dashing, and influential. No wonder so many women were crazy about him. When he drew closer, the host's eye glistened with enthusiasm. "Now let's welcome Mr. Huo," she announced, her voice trembling from the sheer thrill of being near him, "who we are lucky to have here with us. He will now be awarding the medal of the gold medalist." One by one, the man presented medals. When it came to the bronze medalist, Carlos inched towards Debbie, accompanied by the host. His face remained nonchalant as though he had never met the woman before. When he stood in front of her, she lifted her head to face him. Bearing in mind that everyone's eyes were on them, a smile crept on her lips, but there was no joy in her eyes. Carlos and Debbie shared cold glances towards one another. Belatedly, he passed the trophy and the prize on to her. According to the program, he would take the hand of the prize winner and give it a firm shake. When Debbie had taken the trophy and the prize with her left hand, she offered the other for him to shake. Carlos looked at her little hand for barely a second, and then rejected it. He looked at Debbie and mentioned with a low voice, "Your hands are filthy." Those 4 words alone were enough to offend her. Thankfully, not a soul heard them. The crowd had eyes on Carlos as he was a dignitary. Everyone was stupefied as they spotted him decline to shake Debbie's hand. They all speculated on it. If it were only him and me here, I'd drag him to the Civil Affairs Department to get the divorce certificate and beat the hell out of him. Debbie clenched her fists indignantly. Anger made itself evident on her face. She despised the man so much. With hundreds and thousands of eyes that watched them, she could only swallow the utter humiliation. Amidst the whole duration of the awarding, Carlos had his back facing against the camera, so only the ones on stage saw what he had done. How Debbie wished she could throw the trophy and the prize into the trash bin. The mere thought that it had been infected by Carlos' germs disgusted her. Again, she could only do this in her imagination. Event officially done, Debbie and her friends returned to the university. Setting foot in the entrance, they were stopped by Gail, who asked Debbie to keep her end of the deal. Intending for the second option, which was to lock Curtis in his office, Debbie recalled what the disrespectful Carlos had done. "If he happens to see me confess my love to him, he'd probably get so pissed. Oh my god, I actually kind of want to see how he'd react to it now," she thought to herself in glee. momentarily mulling over her decision. Debbie wore a cunning smile and walked her way to one of the groves located in the university, with her friends tagging along. Fortunately, it was a weekend and there were few students on the campus. The grove was covered in silence. Debbie turned to her friends and gestured for them to wait until she finished. Then she went deep into the grove and found an old tree. Standing across the tree, she mustered the loudest voice she could and yelled, "Carlos Huo, I love you. Carlos Huo, I love you." The agreement was for her to repeat it 10 times. Debbie did just that. At the 10th, she screamed, causing the birds that rested in the tree to take to the air. Effortlessly accomplishing the task, Debbie patted herself against her chest to calm down. What she didn't expect was for a man to appear behind the tree, and when she recognized who he was, she was flabbergasted. The man was Curtis. Oh my God! Debbie became pale. Why is Mr. Liu here? She wondered to herself. Flustered, Debbie started to sweat. Holy crap, this is so humiliating. He might tell Carlos about this. I have to make a run for it. Burying her face in her hands, Debbie pivoted and then sprinted to depart from the grove. Tomboy, where are you going? Dixon asked, muddled. Do you have a bear chasing you? Approaching a halt, Debbie stopped upon sighting Dixon. She swiveled, her eyes scanning the area. No signs of Curtis were found. I guess he failed to recognize me. Debbie thought and sighed in relief, although I already saw him before. I think it was back in the dean's office. As Debbie was aware of Curtis' relationship with Carlos, her mind spiraled downwards with her thoughts. But what if he recognized me and then tells Carlos about it? Wait, I'm Carlos' wife, and it is perfectly normal for a wife to speak of her love about her husband. Relief washed over her as she mused over the thought. As she passed Gail, she wore a smug grin, absolutely proud of what she had done. Gawking at Debbie's waning figure in that manner stirred confusion inside Gail's mind. Why's she so happy? Doesn't she know that Mr. Huo hates women who try to court him? That confusion ultimately mutated into annoyance. Smile all you can, Debbie Nian, for you are screwed once Mr. Huo watches this. Drawing her phone out, she then sent the video she had captured over to an individual. Back in the dormitory, Debbie had an eerie feeling that remained inside her. Unable to exactly pinpoint what it was, she felt stumped. She unknowingly discovered herself looking at the half-marathon event that had happened. As if an entity had taken over her body, she instantly searched up for the list of participants at the half-marathon. Then it hit her. That bitch's name isn't even on the list, she screamed in silence. She planned all of this through. She knew the former silver medalist would attend the game, so she lured me in and humiliated me on purpose, searching for an object to vent her anger out on. She grabbed a pillow and slammed it against the wall. You better start sleeping with one eye open, Jail Moo, she cursed inwardly. Meanwhile, in the ZL group, a spacious conference room was fully occupied. It was the latest electronics product launch event, and all reporters had their equipment set up to capture the event in its entirety. The general populace knew that products from the ZL group would always set the trend. The facilitators of the event then arrived at the conference room. They consisted of Carlos and several other senior executives. All cameras were aimed at the seniors. It was protocol for all reporters that photographs or videos where Carlos could be seen were forbidden. Otherwise, he'd resort to forcing them to delete the photo, and in extreme cases, suing them. Only when Carlos and the senior executives took their seats did the others do the same. The general manager gave an opening speech before giving the floor to the vice general manager on introducing their newest products. All ears were on the vice general manager's speech. BN. A universe of stories awaits. The speech was finished, and the next in order was to showcase their newest products with a projector. The projector was then switched on by remote control by the vice general manager. However, no product appeared. Instead, there was a girl yelling in front of a tree. Hearing that familiar voice instantly made Carlos' brows wrinkle together. Carlos Huo, I love you. Carlos Huo, I love you. This was uncalled for. No one saw it coming. All eyes widened like plates in shock, their jaws dropping to the ground. Carlos' face turned grim at the accident. Merely hearing her voice had him feel revolted. This girl again? She's just everywhere right now, isn't she? They did not just have the employee of the ZL group and reporters as their audience. Rather, they had the whole world watching. Each and every person in that conference room shifted their sight to Carlos, anticipating his response. Carlos' assistant, Emmett, was there and witnessed the whole scene unfold. He too got to put a name on the woman. Isn't that Mrs. Huo? Even in an unforeseen predicament, Carlos remained composed, expressionless. All the more did the people look up to him in admiration. Nothing phases him. No wonder he successfully runs a large group. Exhibiting the same trait similar to Carlos was the vice general manager, as he came to a realization that someone must have tampered with his flash disk. Assessing if the product information was still stored in the flash disk, he heard Carlos' voice continue. Right after the detestable video of Debbie professing her so-called love had ended, the screen correctly displayed the products. In terse consideration, Carlos took out his phone and dialed someone's number. Curtis, do you know of a student called Debbie Nian? Carlos asked. Then he frowned and wondered, why does this name sound so familiar? What about her? Curtis asked in reply. I want you to expel her. Carlos demanded. Now, there was certainly no other woman that managed to hit every nerve in his body. Retribution must be imparted. Asking for bloodshed was too far, hence Carlos asked her to be expelled. Reporters proceeded to erase all traces of photo and videos they had managed to take, for they couldn't afford to enrage Carlos. Despite all of that, the entire world practically saw Debbie. The viewers definitely had already captured the whole thing on their phones. As the launch pressed on, Debbie's information was uncovered for the entire world to learn about.